You arrive sometime around the year 1852 in the greatest city on earth. The British Empire commands oceans, railways, colonies and factories whose output is reshaping the world. Steam engines thunder across the countryside. Iron bridges arch over rivers. Ships crowd the Thames so tightly that the water itself seems buried beneath wood and smoke. And yet the first thing London offers you is not majesty, it is breath, or rather, the slow creeping realization that every breath here carries a price. By dawn, the city exhales soot. By noon, it carries the taste of sulphur and horse sweat. By evening, fog and coal smoke have fused into a living wall, a thing that enters your mouth before your mind has registered what it is. Your eyes sting, your throat rasps, your collar is permanently steeped in smoke, curtains darken by the week, teeth yellow by the month, and the lungs, quietly, begin to tighten. You start coughing within days of arrival. Everyone does. The unsettling part is that nobody considers this remarkable. Children cough, bakers cough, judges cough, clerks cough, chimney sweeps cough black mucus into filthy handkerchiefs before disappearing into flues barely wider than their shoulders. Factory girls inhale cotton fibers until their lungs crackle like crumpled paper. Dock workers breathe river rot and industrial ash simultaneously. Even wealthy gentlemen, living well away from the slums, wake each morning to a faint, unmistakable taste of coal at the back of the throat. The city itself breathes through a million chimneys, and you are caught inside its lungs. Tonight, I want to take you through the streets of Victorian London, not to show you what the city looked like, but to show you what it felt like to inhale it. You will breathe the smoke of 1,000 furnaces. You will walk through fogs so thick that men drowned within sight of the shore. You will step inside factories where the air itself became a weapon. You will learn why London's famous fog was not truly fog at all. And by the end, you may come to understand something rather disturbing. The Industrial Revolution did not merely transform cities. It transformed the interior of the human body. Before London poisoned its air, the city smelled different. Not clean. London was never clean, but different. In earlier centuries, the city smelled biological, of mud and sewage, fish markets and tanneries, open drains, and the raw, organic business of urban life. It was unpleasant, certainly, but it was a smell produced by the living. The Industrial Revolution changed the nature of that smell entirely. Now the city smelled burned. Coal had become the black heartbeat of Britain. It heated homes, powered factories, drove steam engines, fueled ironworks, cooked meals, boiled water, ran breweries, operated laundries, fed glass furnaces, moved trains, and lit entire districts after dark. It was woven into virtually every function of modern life. And unlike wood fires, coal did not vanish politely into the atmosphere. Coal left fingerprints. The poorest households burned cheap coal packed with sulphur and impurities, thick, acrid smoke pouring endlessly from rooftops while entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath hanging clouds of soot. Wealthier homes could afford marginally cleaner fuel, but even the grandest districts remained trapped beneath the same citywide canopy of haze. The smoke settled on everything, on window glass and hat brims, on bread left to cool on sills, on laundry hung out to dry, on skin, on stone, on lungs. Visitors arriving in London for the first time often describe the place as though it were under permanent assault from some strange, unnatural weather. But this was not weather. This was industry made visible. One foreign traveller wrote that London's sky resembled a surface rubbed with charcoal. Another noted that the sun appeared pale and sickly, like a lamp behind dirty glass. Buildings seemed permanently stained. Snow rarely stayed white for more than a few hours. Freshly washed linen darkened within days. Even flowers struggled to bloom in the grime-thickened city air. By the 1850s, London's smoke had grown so pervasive that people had developed an entirely new relationship with colour itself. Painters adjusted their palettes, architects accepted soot as inevitable, clothing fashions tilted darker, not for elegance but practicality. Lighter fabrics looked filthy within days. Black became sensible, not stylish. The city was slowly repainting itself in smoke. And the deeply uncomfortable truth was that most Londoners understood this as progress. Smoke meant factories were running. Factories meant wages. Wages meant survival. To criticize the smoke was, in certain circles, to criticize prosperity itself. So the city continued burning, hour upon hour, day upon day, year upon year. Millions of fires inhaling oxygen and exhaling poison into the skies above the greatest city in the world. Before London poisoned its air, the city smelled different. Not clean. London was never clean, but different. In earlier centuries, the city smelled biological, of mud and sewage, fish markets and tanneries, open drains, and the raw, organic business of urban life. It was unpleasant, certainly, but it was a smell produced by the living. The Industrial Revolution changed the nature of that smell entirely. Now the city smelled burned. Coal had become the black heartbeat of Britain. It heated homes, powered factories, drove steam engines, fueled ironworks, cooked meals, boiled water, ran breweries, operated laundries, fed glass furnaces, moved trains, and lit entire districts after dark. It was woven into virtually every function of modern life. And unlike wood fires, coal did not vanish politely into the atmosphere. Coal left fingerprints. The poorest households burned cheap coal packed with sulfur and impurities, thick, acrid smoke pouring endlessly from rooftops while entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath hanging clouds of soot. Wealthier homes could afford marginally cleaner fuel, but even the grandest districts remained trapped beneath the same citywide canopy of haze. The smoke settled on everything, on window glass and hat brims, on bread left to cool on sills, on laundry hung out to dry, on skin, on stone, on lungs. Visitors arriving in London for the first time often describe the place as though it were under permanent assault from some strange, unnatural weather. But this was not weather. This was industry made visible. One foreign traveller wrote that London's sky resembled a surface rubbed with charcoal. Another noted that the sun appeared pale and sickly, like a lamp behind dirty glass. Buildings seemed permanently stained. Snow rarely stayed white for more than a few hours. Freshly washed linen darkened within days. Even flowers struggled to bloom in the grime-thickened city air. By the 1850s, London's smoke had grown so pervasive that people had developed an entirely new relationship with colour itself. Painters adjusted their palettes, architects accepted soot as inevitable, clothing fashions tilted darker, not for elegance but practicality. Lighter fabrics looked filthy within days. Black became sensible, not stylish. The city was slowly repainting itself in smoke. And the deeply uncomfortable truth was that most Londoners understood this as progress. Smoke meant factories were running. Factories meant wages. Wages meant survival. To criticize the smoke was, in certain circles, to criticize prosperity itself. So the city continued burning, hour upon hour, day upon day, year upon year. Millions of fires inhaling oxygen and exhaling poison into the skies above the greatest city in the world. The streets are terrible. The factories are something else entirely. You enter a textile mill shortly after sunrise. The first sensation is heat, dense, radiating, relentless. The second is noise, an overwhelming mechanical thunder that makes conversation nearly impossible. The third is the air. It does not feel breathable. Cotton fibers float through the room like a fine invisible mist, machines tearing, spinning and whipping raw material at tremendous speed, filling the space with airborne dust so fine it almost resembles light in certain conditions. Workers breathe this for 12 to 16 hours each day, 6 days a week. Some have been doing so since childhood. At first, newcomers cough occasionally, then constantly. Eventually the body stops resisting, not because the lungs have healed, but because they have surrendered. Victorian factory workers developed conditions that modern medicine would later classify as occupational lung diseases. Textile workers were destroyed by mill fever and chronic respiratory damage from inhaling cotton particles over years of exposure. Coal miners breathed dust until their lungs hardened black, a condition later known as pneumoconiosis or simply black lung. Metal workers breathed toxic fumes. Workers in match factories absorbed phosphorus vapor that dissolved bone and tissue from within. The Industrial Revolution invented entirely new varieties of human suffering. Not the dramatic visible wounds of the battlefield, but slow internal erosion, the kind invisible from across the room, the kind that revealed itself only through the sound of a cough or the color of phlegm spat into a corner. You notice how workers sound older than they appear. A woman of 28 coughs like an exhausted grandfather. A boy of 16 wheezes after climbing a single flight of stairs. Men spit black mucus into the corners before returning without complaint to their machines. Nobody pauses long. To stop is to lose wages. To lose wages is to lose everything. In certain factories, the air grows so thick with particulate matter that sunlight entering through the windows forms solid-looking beams packed with floating debris. You can literally see what people are breathing. The air is not merely contaminated, it is visibly so. Certain industries were especially devastating. In match factories, white phosphorus fumes glowed faintly in the darkness. Workers exposed to them began suffering tooth pain, then gum infections, then jaw deterioration so severe that sections of bone could die and rot away entirely. The condition was called phossy jaw. Victorian newspapers described it with genuine horror. And yet the factories continued operating, because replacing workers was cheaper than redesigning the machinery that harmed them. That may be the most important sentence in the history of Victorian London. Replacing workers was cheaper. The Industrial Revolution ran on coal, but it also ran on disposable lungs. Perhaps nowhere in Victorian London is the relationship between air and survival laid more nakedly bare than inside the city's chimneys. Consider for a moment what it means to be 8 years old, perhaps 6, small enough to fit. That is your qualification. Master sweeps purchased, orphaned and impoverished boys precisely because their bodies could navigate narrow flues. Before modern chimney engineering, fireplaces required constant cleaning to prevent the soot buildup that caused deadly house fires. The solution that Victorian London arrived at was to send children inside, so children became tools. A climbing boy wakes before dawn. He is given a brush, perhaps a small scraper, and sent upward through hot, narrow shafts coated in soot as sharp and abrasive as powdered glass. Sometimes the chimney is still warm from the previous evening's fire. The air inside the flue is thin, hot, and thick with loose carbon. Soot fills the child's mouth, ears, eyes, nose, and lungs as he scrapes the walls clean using his tools, or, when the passage is too narrow, simply his hands. If he panics, he may become wedged. Some suffocated inside the shafts. Some were burned when fires were lit below them in error. Some fell. Others survived long enough for the accumulated damage to destroy them gradually, over years. Chimney sweeps became notorious for chronic respiratory disease, severe skin conditions, and cancer. Their skin darkened permanently. Their eyes remained red and irritated. Their cough was a distinguishing feature of the trade, recognizable at once. Physicians began noticing unusually high rates of scrotal cancer among chimney sweeps as early as the 18th century, one of the first occupations ever formally linked to carcinogenic exposure. The connection between soot and cancer was documented in the medical literature before the Victorian era even began. Yet meaningful reform came slowly, reluctantly, and always too late for the children already climbing. Because London needed heat, and heat required clean chimneys, and clean chimneys required boys small enough to vanish inside them. You watch one emerge onto a rooftop, coughing hard into the frozen morning air. Black soot covers his face from brow to chin, except where tears have carved two pale tracks down his cheeks. He catches his breath. He descends. He moves to the next chimney. Even the river has its own terrible lungs, and they are diseased. The Thames in Victorian London is not merely polluted, it is actively fermenting. Factories discharge waste directly into the water without treatment. Sewage flows through open drains and overflowing cesspits into the river's tributaries. Slaughterhouses release blood and offal. Chemical runoff seeps through the riverbanks. Dead animals, ash, household waste, industrial sludge, and human excrement drift together beneath bridges thick with commerce and foot traffic. Then summer arrives. Heat thickens the smell until it becomes something almost physical. Witnesses describe it as though the river itself were decomposing in the open air. Sweet and sour, chemical and biological. The smell of decay mixed with industrial residue beneath humid skies. You walk along the embankment and instinctively raise your hand to your mouth. The odour enters anyway. During the Great Stink of 1858, an event that actually happened and which actually paralysed the political centre of the empire, the smell grew so overwhelming that the curtains of the Houses of Parliament were reportedly soaked in chloride of lime in a desperate attempt to make the chambers bearable. Members of government gave serious consideration to abandoning the building altogether. The legislative heart of an empire stretching across every continent very nearly evacuated its own capital city because the air had become physically intolerable, and ordinary Londoners simply lived beside it, breathed beside it, ate and slept and worked beside it. Dock workers unloaded cargo within drifting clouds of river vapour and coal smoke simultaneously. Children played near the banks. Women drew water that smelled of industry and rot. At night, fog rolling in from the Thames carried moisture already saturated with the city's contamination. Gaslight reflected in streaks across the oily water, while smoke moved overhead from the chimneys of a city that could not afford to stop burning. London began to feel less like a city and more like a vast, struggling organism trying to process its own waste and failing. The poor suffered most, but wealth offered no immunity. That is one of the most striking characteristics of Victorian London's air. It was profoundly egalitarian in its damage. Yes, prosperous families lived further from the factories. Their houses were larger, their streets less densely packed, their fuel of better quality, their windows thicker. But the atmosphere did not observe social boundaries. Industrial smoke drifted across every district, regardless of the rateable value of the properties beneath it. Fog swallowed Mayfair as readily as it swallowed Whitechapel. The air above London belonged to no one, and it contaminated everyone. Physicians treating aristocratic and upper-class patients began routinely recommending that their charges leave London altogether for extended periods, particularly in winter. Seaside holidays became associated not merely with leisure and fashion, but with physical recuperation. The concept of fresh air as a restorative treatment became medically accepted precisely because London's own air was understood at some level to be making people ill. Fresh air became a luxury product. Consider what that means for a moment. The simple act of breathing unpolluted air, something every living creature requires to survive, had become a privilege available primarily to those who could afford to travel away from the city in which they earned their living. Upper-class Victorians escaped to Bath, Brighton, the Lake District, or their rural estates, partly because London's atmosphere wore them down physically. Chronic bronchitis became common across all social classes. Persistent coughing embedded itself so thoroughly into daily life that many Londoners accepted it as merely a feature of growing older. Even Queen Victoria, it is said, found London's heavy fogs deeply disagreeable. And yet the city continued to attract and hold people with extraordinary gravitational force, because London offered what nothing else in Britain could: opportunity, trade, employment, power, status, money. You could loathe the air and still require the city. You could understand, on some half-formed level, that the atmosphere was harming you and still return to it every autumn because the alternative was poverty. Which perhaps does not sound entirely unfamiliar. The longer you remain in Victorian London, the more your body begins to adapt in ways that should alarm you. Your clothes carry a faint, permanent smell of burning that no amount of washing entirely removes. Your handkerchief darkens after blowing your nose. Your throat feels raw each morning, as though the night has scraped it clean. You cough without noticing, a habit acquired so gradually it no longer registers as unusual. Your lungs begin to expect resistance. This may be the most unsettling truth about industrial pollution on a human scale. People normalize almost anything, given sufficient exposure. Victorian Londoners did not wake each morning with a clear awareness that the air was shortening their lives. Most simply lived, worked, coughed, continued, because survival rarely leaves much room for environmental reflection. But the evidence was accumulating all around them, even if nobody had yet assembled it into a coherent picture. Physicians working in the dense industrial districts of East London and the manufacturing cities of the Midlands were recording mortality rates that baffled and disturbed them. Insurance actuaries noticed, in their dry columns of figures, that lifespans in heavily polluted areas were measurably shorter than in comparable rural populations. Children raised in proximity to factories and ironworks appeared physically diminished, smaller, paler, weaker, compared with children raised even a short distance from the smoke. Meanwhile, science was advancing, however tentatively and unevenly. Researchers began taking airborne particles seriously as a subject of study. Public health reformers, a new breed of determined, empirically minded individuals, were beginning to connect overcrowding, atmospheric contamination, polluted water, and disease with increasing precision. John Snow's meticulous investigation of a cholera outbreak in Soho in 1854, tracing the source to a single contaminated water pump rather than to the miasmatic air, transformed medical understanding of how disease actually spreads. Joseph Bazalgette's vast sewage engineering project, begun after the Great Stink of 1858, redesigned the relationship between London and its own waste. Slowly, painfully, and always in the aftermath of catastrophe, modern public health was assembling itself from the wreckage. But reform arrived after damage. It always does. That pattern repeats itself throughout the history of industrialization. Human civilization tends to discover the full scale of a danger only after millions of people have already lived and died inside it. Now imagine London at midnight, factories still burning, steam hissing from iron pipes across the river, the distant clang of metal against metal somewhere beyond the fog, horse hooves ringing across wet cobblestones, gas lamps flickering behind curtains of sulphurous yellow murk, a chimney sweep asleep against a wall beside his soot-black brushes, a coughing child sharing a narrow bed with 3 siblings in a single room off a Bermondsey court, a seamstress rubbing her burning eyes after 14 hours bent over stitching by candlelight in a room that has never been properly ventilated, a river breathing rot and chemical residue into the cold night air, and above all of it, smoke. Unceasing, ubiquitous, patient smoke. The Industrial Revolution is usually represented through its machinery, railways, engines, factories, ironworks, the great engineering achievements of a confident and expanding empire. But machines account for only half the story. The other half entered human lungs. Every empire leaves its traces in the world. Ancient Rome left roads. The British Empire left trade routes, legal systems, and railways across 4 continents. But Victorian Britain also left something else: soot, in the lungs of the people who built the furnaces and cleaned the chimneys and breathed the fogs and outlived, just barely, the factories. Standing in the darkness of 19th century London, you begin to understand something that the official histories rarely say plainly. The city was consuming its own people as fuel, not with any deliberate cruelty, not with any single villain giving orders from a counting house, but systematically, structurally, through the accumulated logic of an industrial civilization that had grown faster than any human institution could properly reckon with. The cost was being paid breath by breath, lung by lung, life by shortened life. If you had walked through Victorian London for a single evening, one cold November night in, say, 1856, you might have returned home with rather romantic memories. The glowing gas lamps haloed in fog, the silhouettes of top hats and hansom cabs, the mystery of streets that dissolved at 20 feet, the atmosphere, in the literal sense, thick and amber and cinematic. Modern films still portray it in exactly that way, and one understands the appeal. But the real London smelled harsher and felt heavier. It hurt more. The fog was not magical, it was chemical. The smoke was not scenic background, it was entering people's bloodstreams with every breath they drew. The beauty that distance lends to the Victorian cityscape evaporates almost entirely the moment you stand inside it and inhale. Victorian London delivered to the modern world an uncomfortable and enduring lesson that progress and damage are not opposites. They can occur simultaneously, in the same city, in the same decade, sometimes in the same breath. A civilization can produce genuine wonders, engineering marvels, cultural achievements, scientific advances that reshape the course of human history, while simultaneously and quite methodically destroying the health of the people who made those wonders possible. Perhaps that is why this era retains such a hold on the imagination, not merely for the grandeur of empire, or the ingenuity of the engineers, or the spectacle of a world being remade at industrial speed, but because beneath all of that lies another story, quieter, more intimate, and in some ways more important. A story told through coughing fits and blackened handkerchiefs, through children climbing into chimneys at dawn, through women whose lungs crackled like paper, through a river so foul it embarrassed an empire into building drains. The Industrial Revolution changed the world. But first, it changed the air.